Hey, how are you, Sebastian?
I'm fine.
Good. So I'm really glad that we're here in Cairo together. And finally, after 3 years, I get to have a conversation with you for Egypt migrations. And I really just wanted to get started with how did you get into the field and what drew you to Egypt specifically?
Yeah, it's a really long story, and but just the last days I realized that it's been, I, I think 20 or 21 years since I first arrived in Cairo. I was at the time, I was studying, Arabic and Islamic studies, and there was an opportunity after 2 years of study to do an Arabic language course. So I came here in September 2001,
Okay.
and I moved in with two friends who were also studying Arabic in Dohi. Yeah, and that's how it all started in a way, with Egypt. And
And what did you think of Egypt when you arrived?
it was overwhelming in the beginning, but it was a good time. It was difficult, really. I think it wasn't easy, and people being hassled on the street. It still happened to me. I don't. At some point, it has completely stopped, but at that time, there were still these really everyday problems, and some of those maybe the younger people can't even imagine. Like we were before we had to take a taxi every day to go to the institute. So we were all the time trying to get fakka, to be able to pay the taxi without having to have a discussion with the taxi driver. Because if you couldn't pay the exact amount, they wouldn't give you return money and so on.
Yeah.
So every time you go, where can we, which place can we go and pay with like a £20 note, so that we can get some £1 notes and stuff like that. Anyway, but I also like Cairo sort of from the beginning. I liked walking around old neighborhoods, and yeah, somehow Egypt kind of entered my heart
Yeah.
very early on. And then, of course, you're not asking about old stories, but about the research. And when I finished after that, I didn't come back to Egypt for a while, because of course you have different countries that you can get interested in Middle Eastern studies, and there's a German institute in Lebanon, so I found an opportunity to go there for an internship. And I also, when I did the master thesis at the time, I found an opportunity to find a subject where I could go there and interview some people. So for a while I didn't really think I was going to go into study Egypt again, until basically I started out doing a PhD, and at the same time sort of got to know my wife, who's from Egypt. And as things go, I applied for a scholarship to go to this German institute in Lebanon and didn't get accepted, and started thinking about how am I going to have a life between living in Germany and all that with my wife in Egypt, or her family and Lebanon. So I thought, yeah, maybe it's not such a bad idea. It's just do your PhD about Egypt. I mean, you have family there now, and because they're Copts, I started getting interested in the Coptic issue, and I've always been sort of like a book person, loved going to the bookstores and looking at the books. And so I had sort of the impression that people were starting to discuss, like there were a few books about the Copts. but there wasn't any scientific literature really about it, or very few and in between. So yeah, that's how I decided maybe that could be a subject for a PhD, and I would just start out doing it.
And of course, the Coptic Question in the Mubarak Era, your book, is foundational. Like, we all rely on it in the field, and I wanted to learn a little bit more about what drew you to the research and how that research progressed, but also, in your mind, what its broader significance is for understanding the Coptic question.
The research, as every PhD student, I started out with a kind of research idea, mostly made up in my mind and not in reality. And at the time, I was pretty much interested. My first sketch was that I would be doing a discourse analysis of how people are discussing the Coptic issue in Egypt. And during research, I was more and more becoming frustrated with, having all the books and seeing how that there are really different perspectives on the, issue. Some Copts complaining enormously about discrimination and persecution in the most strident tones, and others calling all of this exaggerated and stressing the idea of the national fabric of Muslims and Copts. And I want to, okay, so you have these different perspectives, and at some point I was drawn to wanting to know how can we verify any of this? I mean, I know it sounds naive in a social science context, but I wanted to know what's the reality. I mean, at least can we know more about the real life, and where does discrimination happen? Does it happen more to some people than to other people? Why are some people convinced that there's this harmonious coexistence, and other people are so frustrated? And how does this come about? How can we explain it? So that's how I ended up maybe writing this very broad-reaching PhD, because and in the end also the book, because sort of instinctively I was drawn to trying to reach some sort of firm ground on social scientifically speaking. Do we have numbers? Do we have observations that we can generalize, and also maybe to in some areas find out that we don't have much. I'm glad that it's still helpful to people who are trying to get into the issue. Yeah.
Of course it is. It absolutely is. And one thing that I particularly enjoyed about the book is how there is divergent views being presented. There are different, I don't want to say camps, but different loyalties and different affiliations. And there is an effort on your part, a really important effort on your part, to show that there isn't a monolithic kind of Coptic community. And how important do you feel that is, particularly in the context of current, and past writing about the Copts and the Coptic community? How fractured is not a good word, but how are there, what kind of divisions exist within Coptic communities in Ghana, in Egypt, but also perhaps even outside of it?
Well, I believe it's really important. It's, to me especially, I think, and as a social scientist or also historian partly, it's been one of my main motivations. And I don't think I got very far in the book. And I also, I mean, really more at the end of my research or towards, I found out about how little I understood about all these things. And I remember one distinct moment that was even after the book, and when I was writing a draft, and I showed it to one of the main persons who influenced the book, and who I wrote about, Samir Morros. And at some point he asked me, "Do you know where I come from?" And I said no, and then he said, "You know, I'm from a leftist family, and from Shubra," and talked a little, and I think I was, before that, I'd been too shy, to ask people this question, but it's very, that was one of the moments when I realized how important it is to know where, which social environment people come from. And of course, very early on, when I got to know Egypt a little better through my wife, I realized how much Egypt was a society characterized by class, cultural milieus, class seemed to me like much more, at least much more visible, or even, obvious than as I know from German society. In German society, people be shy to talk in a classist way about other people. In Egypt, it's pretty normal for middle or upper class people to distinguish themselves sharply from, other groups in society. And of course, that it's the same with the Copts. And for me, that's one of the most interesting things, how this goes together. I think we can't deny that probably the Coptic community is a relatively homogeneous community within. They have a sort of coherence, at least they have the church as an institution that's widely accepted, and they have a kind of sort of coherence that doesn't exist with Egyptian Muslims, who are really divided between different religious cults. So it's not the same, but it interacts. It's not just class, but it interacts with this religious religious culture in a very interesting way.
Yeah. No, and I love that you bring up positionality, right? A positionality of those that you engaged with, your own positionality, and on that note, I just wanted to get a better sense of how do you define your relationship to the populations that you study, and in regard vis-a-vis your positionality, but also what responsibility do you feel in sharing their stories?
Well, I think the most important motivation for me has always been this first realization when you come to Egypt and you realize how little you understand about this society. The people are also people, but there's so many things that you don't understand why, and I'm always humbled by this challenge to probably it's not just because I'm from a different place. If I'd start trying, if I was working in Germany, I was you start trying to ask why are people doing this, and what does this mean? You also start to realize that things that seem like self-evident to you, all of a sudden it's not at all self-evident. But there is this double, of course. There is this also the cultural difference that makes a difference. During research, I started out, let's say, more like coming from this school that you you read texts, you interpret texts. You know, it's very text-oriented still, Middle Eastern studies in Germany. And I've moved gradually towards. At the beginning, I was very hesitant with interviews, and I didn't really know because I hadn't received any training, you know, in university how to do an interview, and so it just came to happen. And gradually, I realized how much I could learn from doing interviews. Not just because you're asking people about a subject, but because you can use it as an opportunity to get to know more about people. It's not just about the subject you're talking about, but other things, you know, how they talk about it. Maybe if you can do a little small talk, you know more about where they come from, why they think the way that they think, and yeah, it also helps reflect again your own positionality. I mean, you learn to see people in several dimensions. You know, they have a religion, they have a certain social background, they have different experiences. Yeah, there are so many people in Egypt who also have some relationship with foreign countries, and all of that. Goes into this, which is, I think, the main thing about doing good research is using interviews or encounters with people, both as a way of, you know, understanding human complexity and also reflecting on how unique your own experience and point of view is.
And selfish question on my part, but of course, I mean, your book confronts the social, the cultural, but also the political situation, and in your opinion, has the state of Muslim-Christian relations changed considerably since the publication of your book? And is there a second book on the horizon?
Yeah, I think on some things have changed considerably. Mostly, I think, in this relationship between the church and the state. And it seems to me that especially many of the older clergy, they're incredibly happy about the fact that they can in some way rely on the state in a way they couldn't before. Rely on the state to follow up on promises, to sort of recognize Christianity also as a pillar of Egyptian society, which is also their main ambition, I think, more than, you know, issues of individual rights, for example. And there is the church building issue, but of course they have their perspective, which is a little narrow in a way, because they're not questioning the nature of the state. And for many of them, it comes natural that the state is an authoritarian state. It's it's a military-led state, and they seem to be happy about the fact that this state, the way it is, works better than it used to work in the Mubarak era. And I'd say they are probably right, comparing to how I studied, what I found out about some of these issues. There is much more straightforward action on the side of the state. They're willing to tackle some issues that in the Mubarak era, these things, they, you know, for decades, basically nothing, you know, then there would be discussions and nothing would happen, and so on and so forth. And there was an immense frustration with it, and also mistrust of the state. And this has changed in some way. Yeah, sometimes quite, this nexus between authoritarianism and improving the situation of the Copts. Sometimes it's even ironic. I just watched an interview with one of the bishops, with also a journalist who also used to be a, let's say, critical guy, but if you're still in the media, you're sort of supporting the current situation. And they both agreed on how great it was that when the state builds a new prison, that they also build a church inside the prison. Yeah.
You bring up an interesting notion about group rights, or rather like the visibility of the church and of Christianity in Egypt, and individual rights and issues of individual, well, I would suppose you could say issues of discrimination and violence. Do you feel like that sense of second-class citizenship among the Copts, that is an important topic and something that has persisted even after the Mubarak era?
I have always thought that this, how people feel this depended very much on their situation, on place and social standing. And it's and probably people in a small village in Upper Egypt have very different problems and experiences of discrimination than a Coptic engineer or doctor who lives in Cairo or Alexandria. I always found that some areas of discrimination are really hard to pin down and I was always hoping that there'd be more research about it. I couldn't tell you if it's nowadays, if you as a Copt you study at university and you go start looking for a job, if this discrimination is more an issue than it used to be 10 or 20 years ago. I couldn't tell. And it's whether today or 20 years ago, it would have in any case been really hard to entangle different aspects of difficulties, the labor market, the need of wasta, and all of these things. How do you know which part is, religious discrimination? But I tend to think also maybe on an everyday level, the fact that Islamism in its different shades has been pushed out of the public sphere, I would tend to think probably increases the, general well-being of Christians, because, especially during the days of the revolution, this became a real worry of most people. What's going to happen to the country if some of these Islamist groups gain power within the state? So probably it's an important aspect, but if we want to know about future developments, of course we should only look at the surface. So these, issues about religious conflict, they mightn't be as visible now as they were before, but that doesn't mean that they are gone and they're not going to re-emerge at a later point. So the most important thing is, in this regard, just don't just look at the surface and go deeper.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect segue to the next question, and that's simply in regards to Egypt and its Coptic populations. What topics and issues would you like to see addressed in future studies?
Yeah, that's a good. Well, first of all, I think it'd be really great if there were more sociological or social science, I'd say, studies about the church as an institution, how it works as an institution. I mean, that would be enormously interesting from a religious studies and a sociology of religion point of view. Because, yeah, I mean, it's such a central institution to Christian life here, and even to people who don't agree with many things inside the church, wouldn't think a moment of leaving. Or not that there are many good alternatives, but still, I mean, and that's something also challenging for like Western scholars even to understand the fact that religion can have or a religious institution can have a totally different role in society than the churches in a Western context. So that would be really interesting. Secondly, I think maybe what I've already said before, this intersection between religion or religious community and classes and other groups in Egyptian society. I really started out with the PhD also. I wrote this. I want to find out about this, but it's so difficult. For a while I was thinking about maybe doing a case study comparing churches in different neighborhoods, like in an upper class neighborhood and in a lower, and see how church life reflects education and class culture. That would have, and that's in this way, the Copts might be such an interesting case of studying class, because it's still an institution that brings all these people together in some way, and you can with Muslim society, in many cases you will just say, you don't have really this overarching institution. People just find their Islam, wherever, however, the way it suits them. So upper class people, they will have their own imam or their own teacher who teaches them religion the way they like it. But the Copts don't have that much freedom to choose. There is the one institution, so the institution, there is more pressure to mold the institution, but there is a pressure from the other side to, in a very centralized institution to assert the authority of the clergy and their ideas of how a Christian community would. That'd be interesting.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I just to say that your work has been inspirational. And I wanted to come back to my selfish question again and ask, what research are you working on now, and can we expect a second edition, perhaps, an update?
I really can't say at this moment. The last 10 years were sort of a period with many turns, and at first, after the PhD, for a while I didn't very much feel like doing more research on the Copts, because you've completed something and also a little tired from that. after that, I've started several attempts to maybe find a new subject, but it never went very far because I didn't have an opportunity to stay in Egypt for a long time. I have I should say that because I'm in Middle Eastern Islamic studies, I also have other subjects that I'm writing on, and I also have to sort of do this strategically in a way, for career considerations. So when I start thinking about the Copts, I always start think in very idealistic terms. If I whatever, get a good position and lots of money to travel and lots of time also, I would really like to do this. So yeah, we'll see if you know someone who might sponsor me. I would love to just take 3 years off and do.
Me too.
Because when you're in a field for a while and you're really interested in it, you also get more ambitious. I mean, in a way you don't want to do. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. It was really great to talk with you.
Thank you.